Staging Shakespeare, a podcast for all those who see William Shakespeare primarily as a dramatist and want to explore ways to stage his plays as live theatre. I'm William Gilbert, and I've been a director and teacher of theatre for nearly 50 years. In that time, I've directed a lot of Shakespeare plays, and I've seen a whole load more in performance. I'd like to share those experiences with you in this podcast as we journey together towards a better understanding of staging Shakespeare. So, let's get started, shall we? Welcome to episode 1 of Staging Shakespeare. Thanks for listening. I hope you'll enjoy it. I'm calling this episode Exit Pursued by a Bear, partly because I thought it would be an intriguing title, and also because, right from the start, I want you to be clear about what it is I'm going to be looking at in these podcasts. I want us to look together at the plays of William Shakespeare as works of theatre, things that have to be staged. So I've chosen a stage direction as the title for this episode, so that you get the idea straight away that what interests me are the practical problems we theatre makers face when we take on a Shakespeare play and try to put it on stage. So let's jump straight in and ask the question, how the hell do I find a bear in this day and age? Exit Pursued by a Bear, it's probably the most famous and most intriguing stage direction in all of Shakespeare's work. It may even be the most famous stage direction of all time. Let's face it, stage directions don't usually attract much attention. Enter Hamlet. Doesn't exactly get your pulse racing, does it? But Exit Pursued by a Bear? Well, that's something quite different. It appears in Act 3, Scene 3 of The Winter's Tale, and it marks the end of Antigonus, the nobleman who's been given the job of destroying the baby Perdita by the misguided and jealous king of Sicilia, Leontes. On the shores of Bohemia, Antigonus leaves the baby to fend for herself, and then is chased off stage by the bear. Later on in the same scene, the clown gives us an account of the offstage death of Antigonus, informing us that the bear has torn him to pieces and presumably eaten him afterwards. The obvious question we all want to ask is, did Shakespeare's company use an actual bear in performance? We want the answer to be yes, don't we? At least that's what I want it to be. It's such a fantastic coup de théâtre. Imagine it. You're a groundling in the Globe Theatre on the 11th of May 1611. That's the date on which the astrologer Simon Forman saw the play, and something he subsequently recorded in his Book of Plays. You've no idea of the plot of the play. So each new scene and each new event arrives as a kind of surprise. Antigonus arrives on stage with the baby, Perdita, in his arms. He places her carefully down stage centre and lays beside her maybe something like a small casket containing information about who she is and gold to pay for her upbringing. Then he stands back. Already we can hear the sound of a storm approaching. Rumbles of thunder created by stagehands rolling cannonballs about in the loft over the stage. And then, just when we thought the storm was going to be the main event, Antigonus looks round. He sees the bear, and so do we. "This is the chase. I'm gone forever," he says. And he runs off, with the bear lumbering after him and roaring. Amazing. The whole audience erupts into applause. Follow that. It's such a great picture, but it probably didn't take place. Of course, we know that there were bears aplenty in that part of London where the Globe was situated. Bear baiting was a very popular form of entertainment, but a bear that was tame enough to act in a performance of a play? It seems unlikely. So how was this incident staged? Let's try and imagine a more workable, a more stage-worthy solution. The Globe Theatre wasn't the only theatre in London, and Shakespeare's company, the King's Men at that time, weren't the only acting troupe that Jacobean audiences could watch performing. Shakespeare's great rivals, the Lord Admiral's men, who performed at the Rose Theatre, had bear skins amongst their list of costumes. They probably used these to costume actors and to dress them up as bears, and in performances of masks at Whitehall, Ben Jonson includes animals such as eagles, griffins and lions. In fact, in Jonson's Masque of Augurs, presented at Whitehall in 1622, there are 3 dancing bears. It's clear from the various humorous references to them in the dialogue that these bears are actually actors in bear costumes. Similarly, in a play called Musidorus, acted before King James in 1610, there's a clownish bear which, again, is clearly played by a costumed actor. So, much as we might wish to imagine a real bear chasing Antigonus off stage at the Globe Theatre, an actor in a bear costume seems most likely. Strangely, though, the other appearances of bears in Jacobean theatre seem to be more like comic turns than threatening apparitions. Was Shakespeare's bear a comic one? Is that how we ought to stage the death of Antigonus, as a kind of farce? After all, the shepherd and the clown turn up immediately after. If you were staging this scene, what kind of bear would you go for? And what kind of atmosphere would you want it to create? And that's a really important question, and one which different directors have responded to in a variety of ways over the years. I first saw The Winter's Tale in performance at the Royal Shakespeare Theatre in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1976. Yeah, that is a long time ago. The production was directed by John Barton, and Ian McKellen was Leontes. It was designed by Di Seymour, and she and Barton decided to set the play in a Lapland setting. At the rear of the stage was an arrangement of wooden pillars, in between which were screens or curtains with diagrammatic folk images. In the centre of the stage, like a giant flash of wooden lightning, was a withered tree. There was a lot of information in the programme about the importance of bears to Lapland culture. Now, not surprisingly, I'm no expert on this, so it came as something of a surprise to me to find that in Lapland in winter, rather than bury or cremate their dead, they leave the bodies out in the snows for the bears to eat. Whilst this all sounds a bit gruesome, the logic of this is that the Laplanders rely on the survival of the bears for things like meat and fur. And if in winter the bears run out of food, well, this isn't great for either the bears or the Laplanders. So it makes sense to leave them some food during the winter months, even if this food happens to be grandma or granddad. Anyway, back to our theatrical bear. The death of Antigonus in this production had all the feeling of a kind of religious ritual. Having deposited Perdita on the ground, Antigonus stood up and took a couple of steps back. Then, quite unexpectedly, behind him one of the screens was swept aside like a curtain being drawn. Standing there was a very tall individual, robed in a priestly costume, wearing a bear mask on his head. He strode forward to stand behind Antigonus, towering over him. Then, with a graceful and almost gentle action, the bare-headed priest placed an arm around Antigonus and drew him to him, almost in an embrace. Together, the two of them then retreated from the stage, back beyond the wooden pillars, and the screens were drawn in front of them as they disappeared from view. The whole thing was like some kind of ancient ritual, full of harmony and serenity. It was a moment I have never forgotten, and it stands in my memory as a beautiful and intelligent solution to what is inevitably a difficult moment to stage. The Winter's Tale isn't a play I've directed myself, so fortunately I've never had to come up with a workable solution to exit pursued by a bear. If you've directed it or seen a really good solution on stage, do let me know by adding a comment on this podcast. I'll give some contact details at the end. It's always great to learn about new or different ways of staging Shakespeare. I suppose that's the fascination of working on these plays. They do seem to offer the most astonishing range of options to a creative team. The key to staging the bear effectively, though, seems to me to find a way that seems organic and integral to the whole atmosphere and feel of the production and its world. That was what was so impressive about John Barton's solution in the 1976 RSC production. It made complete and utter sense. It wasn't bolted on, it felt just right. It doesn't always work out that way, even in the hands of the most talented of directors. Just over 20 years later, in 1998, the RSC once more turned to The Winter's Tale, directed this time by Doran. In fact, the company had staged the play 4 other times between Barton's and Doran's productions, and I'd managed to see 2 of those. But it's the Doran production with Anthony Sher in the role of Leontes that I want to talk about, because its solution to the staging of the bear was, and I'm sorry to have to say it, so lamentable. We need to start by getting a sense of the look of the production, which was designed by Robert Jones. The opening scenes of the play were set in a Sicilia that looked very much like a kind of Edwardian Ruritania. Frock coats and elaborately braided uniforms were much in evidence. The set consisted of grey panelled walls with a ceiling of yards and yards of billowing silk whose colour changed along with the moods of Leontes. Arriving on the shores of Bohemia, however, Antigonus found that this silky material had made its way down from the ceiling to cover the back of the stage. It now looked more like a jagged seascape with what seemed like jutting spars holding it up in folds. And so far so good. But now comes the crucial moment we've been waiting for. What kind of bear have Doran and Jones up their sleeves? Antigonus moved to the front of the stage, placed the baby Perdita on the ground, along with a booklet explaining who she was and a small casket of gold and jewels. As he did so, behind him the folds of silk began to move. Watching it, I was reminded of a child playing at being a ghost or a monster hiding under a large bedsheet. The effect was, for me at least, distinctly underwhelming. As Antigonus reached the end of his speech, the bedsheet bear, which by now had more clearly 3 features, a head and 2 hands, or rather paws, I suppose, moved forward to tower over him. And then, oh no, a flashing light, a moment or two of strobe, and then darkness. Dear me. What a complete cop-out. What a total lack of imaginative ingenuity. What a disappointment. Instead of exit pursued by a bear, it was exit swallowed by a giant bedsheet. Although Greg Doran's production was widely acclaimed, I personally found it rather dull. Anthony Sher's performance was supposedly based on deep psychological research. For me, he was simply lackluster. It gives me no pleasure to say that. In fact, I think Sher is a tremendous actor, and I've thought so ever since I saw him as a minor member of the Nottingham Playhouse Company back in the late 1970s. But sometimes even the best actors and directors don't quite seem to make a Shakespeare play fly in the way it ought to do. This production just sat on the runway, revving its engine. In my opinion, it never took off. Well, that's it for this episode. My aim is to produce an episode every fortnight, and given that there's so much to discuss about staging Shakespeare, I'm hopeful that I can keep to that timetable. Do please subscribe to or follow the podcast so you get to hear as soon as the next episode is posted. And don't forget to give the podcast a rating if your podcasting platform allows you to do that. Not all of them do, so if it doesn't allow that, then you can find the podcast on YouTube as well, and you can like it there. And you can also put a comment, which will be gratefully received. Or you can email me at podcaststagingshakespeare@gmail.com. I hope you've enjoyed thinking about exit pursued by a bear. Thanks for listening. Bye now.